The creek had been here longer than anyone in the neighborhood. Its water whispered through the trees, winding past my land before sliding gently under the bridge into the open fields. It was the kind of place kids caught tadpoles in jars. Deer bent their heads to drink, and the air stayed cool even in July. But to the HOA it was an eyesore. They said it looked messy and made the area too wild. One morning I woke up to the roar of cement trucks outside my house. At first I thought they were doing road work, but when I saw the gray sludge spilling down into my creek, my stomach twisted. They weren't just filling a hole, they were killing a living thing. The water gurgled and fought to escape, but the concrete smothered it. I shouted at them to stop, waving my deed in the air, but the foreman just shrugged. HOA orders, he said. Nothing you can do about it. They were wrong. By the time, while it's done, the million-dollar houses they had built so proudly were sitting in the middle of a swamp. Driveways were flooded, basements reeked of mold, and their picture-perfect lawns were sinking into mud. The same people who ignored my warnings were now begging me for help, but I remembered their smirks when they poured the concrete, and how they laughed when I threatened to sue. They thought they could erase nature without consequence. They didn't realize nature always takes back what's hers, and I was ready to make sure she did it in style. I'd lived by that creek my whole life. It wasn't just a strip of water cutting through the land, it was the soul of this place. My grandfather used to tell me it was the reason our family first settled. Here, water brings life, he'd say, tossing pebbles into the current, and if you respect it, it'll take care of you. I believed that. Even as a kid, I'd spend hours along the banks, skipping stones, fishing for sunfish, or just lying back on the grass and listening to the way the water spoke in ripples. That creek had seen every season, every storm, every drought, and it always came back. When the HOA moved in, they didn't see any of that. They didn't see history. They didn't hear the water's voice. All they saw was a problem to fix. It started small, a few notes in my mailbox about unmaintained natural space and overgrown vegetation obstructing views from nearby properties. At first, I laughed them off. This wasn't their land. The creek and the stretch of trees surrounding it belonged to me, fair and square. But the letters kept coming, each one with stronger language, each one hinting at community standards and the responsibility of adjacent landowners to maintain aesthetics. I knew the HOA could be pushy, but I didn't think they had the nerve to actually touch my property. That illusion shattered on a Tuesday morning in early spring. It was just after sunrise when I heard it, the low growl of diesel engines and the beeping of heavy machinery reversing. I stepped out onto my porch, coffee in hand, and saw a convoy of cement trucks and an excavator parked along the dirt road that led down to the creek. Men in neon safety vests were pacing around, one of them pointing to a set of laminated papers clipped to a board. I walked down the hill, calling out, "Hey, what's going on here?" One guy glanced up from his clipboard but didn't answer. Another kept unrolling a black tarp along the bank. It wasn't until I stepped right in front of the foreman that I got a response. "Morning," he said flatly, as if this were just another routine job. "Not a good morning if you're here to mess with my land," I shot back. He looked over my shoulder toward the creek. "Orders from the HOA, we're filling this ditch. It's a hazard. Breeding ground for mosquitoes." And honestly, he smirked. "It's ugly, doesn't fit the neighborhood's image." "Ditch," my voice rose. "That's a creek. It's been here longer than your HOA. Longer than me. Longer than those overpriced houses up the hill. And it's not your property to touch." He shrugged, like my words were a mild inconvenience, and turned back toward his men. "Start the pour." The first gush of cement spilled down the chute like wet stone, thick and slow, oozing toward the water. The creek hissed when it touched, the cold current swirling frantically against the invading sludge. My gut twisted, shut it off. I yelled, stepping between the chute and the bank. "You can't do this without my permission. I have the deed right inside my house." "HOA says it's within their right," the foreman replied, his tone still maddeningly calm. "They've got environmental clearance and a vote from the board." That didn't sound right. I'd never been notified about any vote. No one had come to me about environmental anything. But before I could argue further, two of the workers started herding me back toward the road. They didn't touch me, but they made it clear I wasn't welcome in their workspace. I stormed back to my house, grabbed the manila envelope that held every document proving I owned that creek, and returned within minutes. But by then, the first load of concrete had already set like a gray scar across the surface of the water. The current was slowing. Trapped under the weight of the artificial barrier, fish darted in frantic circles, looking for a way out. I held the deed in the foreman's face. "This land is mine, the creek is mine. You're trespassing." He gave it the quickest glance imaginable, then shook his head. "If you've got a problem, take it up with the HOA. We're just following orders." The words hit me like a slap. I'd seen how the HOA operated. They thrived on delay. They'd drag disputes through months of board reviews and legal clarifications until the damage was already done. By the time I'd get a court date, the creek would be gone forever. Still, I wasn't about to just stand there. I pulled out my phone and started recording, narrating every move they made. The trucks, the workers, the chutes, spilling cement. I made sure to get shots of the creek before and after the pour. A few of the men muttered to each other, clearly annoyed, but none of them tried to stop me. By midday, the air smelled like wet stone and diesel. My boots were caked in drying cement from where I'd stepped too close to the edge trying to film. The sound of the water had changed, no longer the lively chatter of a free-flowing creek, but a muffled gurgle trapped under the weight of a man-made tomb. Neighbors started to gather, curious about the commotion. Some of them stood with arms crossed, nodding in approval. Others looked uneasy, whispering to each other but avoiding my gaze. One woman from 3 houses down finally approached me. "I'm sorry," she said quietly, "but the board sent out an email last month. They said the creek was going to cause flooding and mosquito problems if it wasn't dealt with." "I thought you knew." "They never sent anything to me," I said, my voice tight. "This isn't just some puddle. That water drains half the hillside. If they block it, the water's not going to disappear. It's going to go somewhere, and they're not going to like where." She bit her lip, glancing back at the neat rows of houses climbing the slope behind us. "I guess they think it's worth the risk." By sunset, the trucks were gone. What used to be a ribbon of silver cutting through the green was now a solid strip of gray, cracked in places where the last of the water had tried to force its way through before giving up. The trees lining the bank looked wrong, their roots trapped and suffocating under the sudden change. The chorus of frogs I usually heard in the evenings was silent. I sat on the porch long after the last worker left, staring at the dead, silent channel my grandfather's words kept replaying in my mind. "If you respect it, it'll take care of you." The HOA had done the opposite, and I knew nature wasn't going to take this quietly. That night, a storm rolled in. Heavy rain drummed against the roof, and I could almost hear the water trying to reclaim its path, slamming against the new wall of concrete. I stood at the window, watching sheets of runoff cascade down the hill toward the creek bed. It wasn't flowing right. Without its natural channel, the water was pooling in strange places, spilling into yards and garden beds. By midnight, I saw it creeping up the edge of the nearest HOA-owned property. I smiled for the first time all day. If they thought they could bury a creek and get away with it, they were about to learn the truth. Nature doesn't lose, she just waits for her moment. And now, I was going to make sure that moment came sooner rather than later. By morning, the rain had stopped, but the ground was still heavy and wet, the air thick with that earthy smell you only get after a good downpour. I stepped outside, coffee mug in hand, and looked toward the slope where the creek used to run. The cement was already stained dark from the night storm, and here and there, water still trickled over its edges in thin streams. It was like the creek was trying to claw its way back into the world, scratching at the artificial shell the HOA had dumped on it. But what caught my attention wasn't my land. It was up the hill, the row of gleaming manicured homes the HOA always bragged about in their brochures. From my porch, I could see a patch of water glinting in the early light where there shouldn't have been any. It wasn't a puddle. It was a small, stagnant pool forming at the corner of one property. Curious, I grabbed my boots and walked up the road. The HOA president, a tall man named Curtis with perfect hair and a face that looked permanently smug, was already out there, standing with 2 other board members. They were ankle-deep in mud, waving their arms and muttering at each other like someone had stolen their wallets. I slowed my pace, letting them notice me before I got too close. Curtis spotted me, his jaw tightening like I'd brought the rain myself. "You should keep walking," he said, nodding toward the road. "Why?" I asked innocently. "This is HOA property, isn't it? I thought you liked showing it off." He didn't answer, just turned back toward the flooded patch. I could see the problem now. The rainwater that would have normally drained into the creek was collecting at the lowest point of the neighborhood, and it wasn't going anywhere. The soil was already saturated, and with the cement blocking the natural flow, the water had nowhere to escape. "Looks like you've got a drainage issue," I said, keeping my voice casual. "No issue," Curtis snapped. "It's just leftover from the storm. It'll soak in." I almost laughed. "You poured concrete on the only natural drainage this area had. It's not soaking in, it's backing up. You've turned your hill into a bathtub." Here's to board. Buddies exchanged uneasy glances, but Curtis ignored me. "We've got landscapers coming. They'll handle it." I shrugged, pretending to let it go, but inside I was grinning. The landscapers weren't going to fix this. They could pump the water out, but unless they broke through the concrete, it would happen again the next time it rained. And the next. 2 days later, we had another storm. Not as heavy as the first one, but enough to turn that little pool into a shallow pond. The water spread wider, creeping into the edge of a neatly trimmed lawn. By the 3rd day, it had reached the driveway. Curtis called in a construction crew with sump pumps, and I watched from my porch as they worked for hours, hoses snaking across the yards like giant worms when the pumps finally shut off. I figured they'd buy themselves a little time, but then I saw it. Instead of draining away, the water was just moving sideways, seeping into the property next door. It didn't take a genius to realize what was happening. The neighborhood had been designed with the creek as its main drainage outlet. Every pipe, every slope, every runoff ditch led to that natural channel, and now the HOA had sealed it like a coffin. That weekend, I was out in my yard stacking firewood when my neighbor, Beth, came hurrying down the road. She wasn't part of the HOA crowd. She'd been here almost as long as I had, living in one of the older houses near the base of the hill. She looked worried. "You've seen my backyard lately?" she asked without preamble. "No, what's going on? Come look." We walked a short distance to her place and my stomach sank when I saw it. Her entire backyard was underwater, not rushing, not flowing, just sitting there, brown and stagnant. Her garden beds were submerged, the soil churning with worms trying to escape. A half-submerged lawn chair leaned at a sad angle near the porch. "This all started after they poured that concrete," she said, her voice low and tense. "Before, the rain would just move on through. Now it just sits." I nodded. "Because they cut off the only outlet. That water would have gone into the creek." Beth's eyes narrowed. "They can't just ruin my property like this. There's gotta be something we can do." "There is," I said slowly. "But it's not going to be quick." Over the next week, more problems popped up. One family's basement flooded. Another homeowner complained about mosquitoes breeding in the standing water. The HOA sent out a mass email blaming unexpected weather patterns and seasonal saturation, but nobody with half a brain bought it. We'd had storms like this for decades without a single yard turning into a swamp. Then came the day I knew would change everything. It was a warm afternoon, and I was walking down the road when I heard shouting from one of the big houses at the top of the hill. I looked up and saw two men standing ankle-deep in water on a pristine front lawn, except it wasn't a lawn anymore, it was a marsh. The grass was yellowing from being submerged too long, and the water had crept so far up that it was touching the steps to their front porch. Curtis was there too, wearing rubber boots and a scowl that could cut glass. He had a phone pressed to his ear, pacing back and forth like the conversation on the other end was one he didn't want to be having. I didn't need to hear the words to know what was happening. The homeowners were demanding answers, and Curtis had none that didn't make him look like a fool. That night, the HOA sent another email. This one was almost panicked in tone, though they tried to hide it behind formal language. They announced they were exploring solutions and reviewing all prior actions related to water management. It was the closest thing to an admission of guilt I'd ever seen from them. I sat back in my chair reading the email twice, and felt a slow smile spread across my face. The cracks in their control were showing. The real beauty of it was that I didn't have to do a thing. Nature was doing all the work for me. Every drop of rain, every backed-up gutter, every flooded yard was a reminder that the HOA's arrogance had real consequences. The forecast called for more storms the following week. I didn't need to be a meteorologist to know what would happen next. The ground was already waterlogged. The basements were already leaking. The lawns were already drowning. All it would take was one good downpour to turn their precious neighborhood into a full-blown swamp, and when that happened, I'd be ready. Not just to watch, but to make sure everyone knew exactly who was to blame. The first storm of the week rolled in late on a Tuesday night. I could hear it before I saw it. The low growl of distant thunder, the steady hiss of rain sweeping in from the west. By the time I stepped out onto my porch, the air was already heavy with that metallic temp that comes right before a downpour. I leaned against the railing, coffee in hand, and watched the black line of clouds creep over the ridge. When the rain hit, it hit hard. Thick sheets pounded the roof, rattled the gutters, and turned the slope leading down to the old creek into a slick, muddy slide. I could see the water pooling along the edge of the concrete barrier, trying to find its old path. But the creek was gone, buried under the HOA stubbornness, and the water had no choice but to spread out and climb upward. I knew exactly where it would go. By morning, I didn't even need to leave my porch to see the damage. The low-lying section of the HOA's prized neighborhood, the one with the biggest houses and the most manicured lawns, looked like a lake. Driveways were submerged halfway to the garages. Decorative shrubs stuck out of the water like half-drowned ornaments. The community fountain they loved to brag about was completely swallowed, only the very tip of its stone centerpiece visible above the surface. I pulled on my boots and went to see it up close. The air smelled like wet mulch and something sour. The smell you get when water has been sitting just a little too long. Curtis was there, of course, wearing a bright yellow raincoat like it might hide his embarrassment. A few other HOA board members clustered around him, their faces pale and drawn. Homeowners stood on porches or waded through ankle-deep water, shaking their heads. One man I didn't recognize stomped toward Curtis, water splashing around his legs. "My basement's a swimming pool," he shouted. "A swimming pool. Everything down there is ruined. The carpet, the furniture, the wiring. And this," he pointed toward the waterlogged street, "is your fault." Curtis tried to smooth his voice into something calm, but it cracked halfway through. "We're working on a solution. The landscapers are bringing in more pumps." The man laughed bitterly. "More pumps? You think this is a pump problem? The water has nowhere to go." I almost stepped in right then, just to watch Curtis squirm more, but I held back. Better to let them stew in their own mess for a while. Instead, I walked around the flooded area, taking pictures with my phone. Every shot told the same story. water creeping up porch steps, ornamental flower beds underwater, trash cans bobbing lazily down the street. The second storm came 2 days later, smaller but relentless. The pumps the HOA brought in ran all night, groaning and sputtering, but by morning it was clear they were losing the battle. The water wasn't just in the low-lying homes anymore, it was seeping farther uphill, reaching places it had never touched before. Beth came by that afternoon, splashing down my driveway in her rubber boots. "You need to come see this," she said, her eyes wide. We walked to her backyard, and sure enough, the water there had risen higher than I'd ever seen it. Her porch steps were now half submerged, and the wooden posts holding the deck looked like they were sweating under the pressure. The worst part was the smell, not just the usual earthy flood smell, but something stronger, fouler. "It's starting to stagnate," I said quietly. "When water sits too long, it goes bad. That smell's going to spread through the neighborhood." Beth folded her arms. "Let them smell it. Maybe it'll knock some sense into them." By the weekend, the HOA had called an emergency meeting at their little clubhouse. I wasn't invited, of course, but word travels fast in a small community. Someone told me they were discussing possible engineering solutions and long-term drainage redesigns. Translation: they were starting to realize they'd have to undo what they did to my creek that night. The third storm hit, the biggest yet. It started just before sunset, with a wind that rattled the windows and sent the trees bending low. Then the rain came, heavy and cold, hammering everything in sight. I sat inside with a mug of tea, listening to it pound against the roof and picturing the HOA's million-dollar homes filling up like bathtubs. Around midnight, I heard the first siren. I stepped outside and saw flashing lights bouncing off the low clouds. A fire truck was parked halfway down the HOA's main road, its crew dragging hoses toward a house I recognized, one of the biggest in the neighborhood, with a tall white columned porch. Only now, that porch was sitting in knee-deep water, and the basement windows were completely submerged. The fire crew wasn't there to put out flames, they were there to help pump out the flood. More trucks came after that, utility workers, emergency vehicles, even a few county trucks I'd never seen around here before. The HOA board members ran around in rain gear, waving their arms and trying to look like they were in control. But the truth was obvious to anyone watching that lost this fight before it even began. By sunrise, the scene looked almost surreal. The streets had turned into shallow rivers. Some homeowners were using canoes and inflatable rafts to get from their front doors to the main road. Mailboxes stood like lonely sentinels in the water. Lawn decorations bobbed lazily past, their cheerful colors faded in the gray light. The HOA sent out another email that morning, this one almost desperate. They were now considering immediate partial removal of the recent creek modifications to facilitate natural drainage. In other words, they were ready to rip up the concrete. But it was too late for a lot of them. I knew enough about flood damage to know that once water like this got into walls and foundations, the repairs weren't just expensive, they were endless. Mold, rot, shifting soil. Those problems stick around for years. When Curtis finally came to see me, it was 3 days later. He showed up on my porch, his perfect hair flattened under a baseball cap, his boots caked in mud. "We need your help," he said without any of his usual smugness. I leaned back in my chair. "Funny, I remember you saying there was nothing I could do about it." His jaw tightened, but he didn't argue. "We made a mistake. We didn't think it would cause this much disruption." I let the word hang in the air like a bad smell. Disruption. You killed a living waterway and turned your neighborhood into a swamp. This isn't disruption, it's destruction. He shifted his weight, glancing toward the slope where the creek used to run. "If we remove the concrete, will it fix it?" I didn't answer right away. Part of me wanted to let them drown in their own arrogance a little longer, but another part of me, the part that still cared about the land itself, wanted to give the creek a chance to breathe again. "It might," I said finally, "but you'll have to do it right. Not just dig a trench and call it a day. You'll need to restore the banks, clear the debris, let the water flow naturally again, and you'll have to do it under supervision." "Yours?" he asked. "Mine," I confirmed, "and it's not going to be free." Curtis didn't even flinch. "Name your price." I didn't give it to him then. I just told him I'd think about it. But in my mind, the gears were already turning. They'd destroyed something they didn't understand, and now they were paying the price. And if they wanted me to save them, I was going to make sure it cost them more than just money. Curtis left my porch that day with the promise to get back to me. I knew what that meant. He needed to meet with the rest of the board, figure out how much they were willing to swallow their pride, and decide if I was worth the price. I didn't mind the wait. In fact, I welcomed it. The longer they delayed, the worse their swamp problem became, and the more leverage I would have. 2 days later, the HOA sent me an email requesting a private meeting at their clubhouse. I almost laughed out loud. Private meeting. They'd made all their decisions about my land in the open, without me, and now they wanted privacy. Still, I agreed, but not before printing copies of my deed, a few environmental regulations, and the photos I'd taken of their mess. The clubhouse looked different when I walked in. Usually it was polished and bright, with the smell of fresh coffee and air freshener. This time the air was heavy with dampness, and the carpet by the Door squished faintly under my boots. Even their sanctuary wasn't safe from the water. Curtis and 4 other board members sat at a long table, each with a folder in front of them. Curtis tried for a polite smile. "Thanks for coming," he said, gesturing for me to sit. I took my time lowering myself into the chair, letting the silence stretch until one of the women shifted uncomfortably. "So," I said finally, "you need my help." "We do," Curtis admitted. "We've underestimated the impact of filling the creek. Our engineers tell us restoring the natural drainage is the fastest, most cost-effective solution." I repeated, raising an eyebrow. "That's not the word I'd use. You're not just putting back a ditch, you're repairing an ecosystem." One of the men, a stocky guy named Alan, leaned forward. "We're prepared to hire contractors for the heavy work. We just need your approval to access your property." And I cut him off with a wave of my hand. "It's not that simple. You killed the creek. You broke the land's balance. You want to fix it, fine, but you'll do it my way, under my supervision, and with full acknowledgement of what you did." Curtis stiffened. "And what exactly does your way mean?" I pulled out my folder and slid it across the table. Inside was a list not just of demands, but of conditions. "First," I said, "you remove every inch of concrete from my land, and the creek bed by hand, where necessary to avoid further damage. Second, you rebuild the natural banks using native plants, not those ornamental weeds you like to put in. Third, you fund the cleanup of every property downstream that's been damaged by a little project. And fourth," I paused here for effect, "you put it in writing, publicly, that the HOA overstepped, trespassed, and caused this disaster." The room went very still. "That's a lot," Alan muttered. "It's exactly what's needed," I replied. "You don't get to bulldoze nature and then half-fix it when it bites back. You make it right." Curtis cleared his throat. "We can agree to most of that, but the public statement non-negotiable," I said, leaning forward. "Everyone here knows what you did, but you've been trying to spin it as bad weather and bad luck. No more. You tell the truth, or you find another solution and live with the swamp." They exchanged glances, some of them clearly calculating the PR damage. I could almost hear their thoughts. Admitting fault meant lawsuits, angry homeowners, maybe even a change in leadership. But refusing meant the water kept rising, the basements kept flooding, and property values kept sinking. Finally, Curtis sighed. "We'll draft something." "No," I said sharply. "I'll draft it. You'll sign it." For a long moment, nobody spoke. Then Curtis nodded. "Fine, but we need this done quickly. More rain is coming. Then you'd better start digging," I said, standing. The next week was chaos, glorious, muddy chaos. Excavators tore into the concrete barrier while workers with shovels chipped away at the stubborn slabs that the machines couldn't reach without damaging the surrounding land. I walked the site every day, clipboard in hand, making notes, taking photos, and calling out corrections when they cut corners. The HOA board tried to keep their distance, but I saw them lurking, watching the work like nervous landlords checking on a tenant they didn't trust. Homeowners came too, some out of curiosity, others because their yards still squelched when they walked on them. I heard more than one person mutter that they'd never trusted the board's plan from the start. Beth came by one afternoon, leaning on the fence as we watched the workers pry a massive slab of concrete from the creek bed. "Never thought I'd see the day," she said. "Neither did I admitted. "But it's not over yet. This isn't just about getting the water moving. Again, it's about making sure they can't pull something like this again." "You think they've learned their lesson?" she asked. I looked over at Curtis, who was standing knee-deep in mud giving orders to a contractor. His expression was tight, his clothes splattered. "They've learned something," I said. "Whether it sticks, we'll see." It took nearly 2 weeks to fully remove the concrete, and another week to rebuild the creek's banks. The first time the water flowed freely again, I stood at the edge of my property and watched it twist and curl around the rocks like it was stretching after a long, suffocating sleep. Birds returned within days, and the frogs started their evening chorus again. But the real moment came at the next HOA meeting, the one where they had to read the statement. I'd written the clubhouse was packed, the air buzzing with anticipation. Curtis stood at the podium, holding the single sheet of paper like it weighed 100 pounds. He cleared his throat, glanced at me, then began to read. "In the matter of the recent flooding and property damage, the HOA acknowledges that the decision to fill the creek adjacent to Mr. Carter's property was made without his consent and resulted in significant harm to both the natural environment and the homes within our community. We accept full responsibility for this error and are committed to restoring the affected areas to their original state." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Some people looked shocked, others vindicated. I just sat there, letting the words settle into the room like the slow drip of water finding its way home. When the meeting ended, people came up to me, some to thank me, some to apologize, a few just to shake their heads in disbelief. Curtis. I avoided my gaze, but I didn't need his acknowledgement. The creek was alive again, and the truth was out still. I wasn't finished because while the water flowed freely now, the damage to their homes was permanent in ways they hadn't yet realized the soil had shifted, foundations had been stressed, and mold was already taking hold in damp walls. Insurance claims were coming, and with them, higher premiums and lower property values. The HOA had saved their creek, but they'd lost something far more precious to them, the illusion that they were in control. I'd see to it that reminders stayed with them for a long time. The morning after the pumps were shut off, the neighborhood looked like something out of a disaster movie. The once pristine streets were now lined with waterlogged trash bins, floating lawn furniture, and soggy cardboard boxes spilling their contents into the murky flood. The air smelled thick and sour, like wet drywall and decaying grass, and a heavy mist clung to the ground as if the swamp had decided to take permanent residence. I woke up early that day, mostly because I couldn't sleep. My phone had been buzzing with messages from neighbors and even the HOA board members themselves. The tone had shifted entirely. Where once they had barked at me with smugness and superiority, now their voices cracked with desperation. Some wanted me to explain what happened. Others wanted me to fix it immediately. A few even tried apologizing, but their apologies were hollow, the kind that only show up when someone realizes they've lost control. I poured myself a cup of coffee and stood by my back porch, watching the water slosh gently against my fence. Lined a creek. My creek had reasserted itself in the most dramatic way possible. Nature had been patient, but she wasn't merciful. The cement the HOA had poured months ago had cracked and shifted under the relentless underground pressure, and once the water found a path, it took everything in its way. The soil became loose, driveways caved in, and all the artificial landscaping they spent thousands on was now half submerged in muddy water at around 9 a.m. A small group of HOA board members showed up at my door. They were dressed like they'd just walked out of a construction site, rubber boots, rolled-up jeans, and faces pale with worry. Karen, the board president, didn't even bother with her usual fake smile. She looked at me like someone begging a doctor for a miracle. "We need to talk," she said flatly. I stepped aside and let them in, but I didn't offer coffee. They stood awkwardly in my kitchen, dripping water onto the tile. Karen spoke first. "You were right," she admitted, her voice quiet but strained. "We should have never touched that creek. We didn't understand the consequences, but now it's bad. People's basements are flooded, cars are ruined, the roads are cracking. The insurance companies are already saying they won't cover it because it's man-made." I leaned against the counter, arms crossed. "So now you care about what I've been saying for months. Back when I tried to stop you, you laughed at me. You told me I couldn't do anything about it because the HOA had the authority. Well, guess what? The creek had more authority than all of you combined." Her jaw tightened, but she didn't argue. "We're asking for your help," she said, trying to keep her voice calm. "You know the land. You know how to manage the water. We're willing to work with you, pay you to help us fix this." It would have been so easy to agree, to take their money, to be the hero, to restore everything, but I remembered every insult, every threatening letter, every smug meeting where they treated me like a nuisance instead of a neighbor. I shook my head. "You don't need me. You need an environmental engineer, someone with big equipment and months of free time. And from what I've seen, none of you have the budget for that now. You spent it all on concrete and lawsuits." Karen's lips trembled, as if she wanted to lash out, but she knew better. Instead, another board member, a man named Richard, stepped forward. "Please, we'll dissolve the HOA. No more dues, no more restrictions. Just help us save our homes." That caught me off guard. For a moment, I imagined what life would be like without them constantly breathing down my neck. But then I realized they were offering this not because they'd learned their lesson, but because they were cornered. If I helped them now, they'd rebuild their little kingdom the moment the crisis passed. I straightened up. "I'm sorry, but you made this bed or swamp, I guess. And now you're going to have to sleep in it." They left without another word, their boots squelching in the mud outside. Over the next few weeks, things only got worse for them. The city refused to take responsibility because the HOA had acted without permits. Contractors charged them double for emergency work. Some families tried selling their houses, but nobody wanted to buy a property with standing water in the yard and mold creeping up the walls. Home values plummeted almost overnight. I kept to myself during all this, tending to my property and letting nature take its course. The creek, freed from its concrete prison, carved a new path across the neighborhood. It wasn't the gentle stream it once was. It was wider now, faster, and far less forgiving. But it was alive, and that was enough for me. One afternoon, I saw a moving truck outside Karen's house. She was hauling boxes to the curb, her hair tied back and her face pale from exhaustion. For the first time in months, she looked smaller, not physically, but in the way pride can shrink a person when it's been stripped away. She noticed me watching from my porch and hesitated before walking over. "I guess you got what you wanted," she said bitterly. "No," I replied, shaking my head. "I wanted my creek left alone. What happened here? None of it was what I wanted, but it's what you caused." She stared at me for a long moment, then turned and walked away. Without another word, by the end of the month, more than half the houses were empty. The HOA was officially dissolved, though not out of goodwill. They simply ran out of people willing to be in charge of the sinking ship. Those who remained learned quickly that the best way to live here was to leave the land alone. The creek was no longer a line on a map or an obstacle in their landscaping plans. It was a living thing, and it demanded respect. In the quiet that followed, I often sat on my porch at dusk, listening to the water rush past. The frogs had returned, their croaks filling the humid air. Dragonflies zipped between the cattails and herons stood knee-deep in the shallows. The swampy patches eventually became wetlands, attracting even more wildlife. It wasn't the neighborhood the developers had dreamed of. It was better. It was real. And every time I looked out over that wild, untamed view, I felt a quiet satisfaction. Not because I'd won, but because nature had. If you enjoyed this true tale of HOA karma and nature's revenge, check out more incredible real-life stories on my YouTube channel, Bright Reality. For videos like, share, comment, and subscribe to the channel.